So thank you everyone for coming today. I'm Keith Crumwoody, Dean of the Architecture Division at CCA. And I'd like to begin, as we always do with our lectures, with a land acknowledgement. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. CCA campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Tuchenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who've continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those from the lands on which you are joining us virtually today. With our spring 2021 architecture lecture series titled Remaking, we are bringing important contemporary thinkers and makers to CCA to reflect upon the work we must do now to remake architecture and co-imagine a just and equitable future. This spring, we're also celebrating 100 cumulative years of interior design and architectural education at CCA, as our BFA Interior Design program marks its 50th anniversary, our Bachelor of Architecture program its 35th, and our Master of Architecture program its 15th. Throughout the semester, the chairs of each of these programs will host a panel discussion with distinguished program alumni, beginning with Antje Steinmuller, chair of the Bachelor of Architecture program, in conversation with alumni this Friday, February 12th at 12 noon Pacific time. You can find the full spring lecture series along with stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. I encourage you to check out our most recent story, which includes 5 stories from students in last fall's architectural theory class, as well as 2 podcasts with alumni of our BArch and our interior design program. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Brandon Clifford to CCA. A self-described time traveler, Brandon is, at this time, the director and co-founder of Matter Design and an associate professor at MIT. Clifford received his Master of Architecture from Princeton University and his Bachelor of Science in Architecture from Georgia Tech. As a designer and researcher, he's received recognition with prizes such as the American Academy in Rome Prize, the TED Fellowship, the SOM Prize, and the Architectural League Prize for young architects and designers. Working as a kind of scholar, architect, storyteller, Brandon's practice links new digital tools to old building practices through serious technical research into ancient techniques, rigorous material testing, and experimental making, often accompanied by public performances, and the crafty construction of not quite true, but not exactly false narratives. His recent book, The Cannibal's Cookbook, is a case in point. The book, part manifesto, part manual, speaks plainly and directly, with not a little humor, to architect and non-architect alike about the need for and virtues of a reimagined cyclopean masonry architecture of recycled materials. An inspired exercise in genre bending, yes? Yeah. An inspired exercise in genre bending, the book opens with the Cannibalist Manifesto, which wouldn't be out of place in Conrad's Programs and Manifestos on 20th Century, and closes with a beautifully illustrated and humorously annotated collection of recipes for building big stone walls, like the remarkable cyclopean cannibalism that he exhibited at the Seoul Biennial in 2017. One can understand Brandon's work as a critique of computation in architecture, but I would argue that it's better understood as a critique of the larger culture of computation in which we are all immersed, a culture defined by an insatiable desire for the new cities, new buildings, new materials, new forms, new conveniences, regardless of the social, economic, or environmental cost. The power of his work lies in the links forged between ancient and contemporary techniques, not to simulate old forms, but to actualize new models. Instead of a fast architecture of novel forms made of new materials, shaped by new machines and efficiently erected with large equipment, Clifford proposes a rebel renaissance, a slow architecture made of old materials, shaped minimally by new and old machines, and put ceremonially into place, ideally by dancing humans, both big and small, young and old. Through his research and making, Brandon has made an invaluable contribution to our understanding of architecture's ever-expanding catalog of new tools and its often neglected repository of historical models. The bias towards instrumentalization that defines so much of our culture also dominates architectural thinking about the value and benefits of digital technology, where computation is deployed to either enable the production of increasingly complex forms or to optimize the production and operation of buildings and cities. In his work, Professor Clifford pursues a different agenda, leveraging the latent potential of abandoned knowledge, ancient building methods, material philosophies, and ceremonial practices, and harnessing the power of computation to recast the relationship between machines, materials, and humans with the goal of mitigating rather than aggravating the impacts of climate change. I'm thrilled to have Brandon with us today. Please join me in welcoming him as he takes us on a journey back to the future.
Thank you, Keith. That was such a nice introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here also, so thank you for inviting me. I have such a deep respect for the work that's happening at CCA, and it's so great to see so many familiar faces here as well. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to do a kind of behind the scenes tour of a Roman archaeology site. And you have to imagine like a few Americans like making their way through this archaeological site in a fairly casual way that made us quite uncomfortable. There weren't any guardrails up. There wasn't really any protection against the treasures of this site. And along the way, someone behind me stepped on a stone and it rocked and then snapped in half. And we all turned around and just were absolutely mortified and thought, like, of course the Americans show up and we do this. But the Italian archaeologist that was touring us through just casually looked back and said, no, don't worry. That's not an old stone. And I was like so relieved, like, okay, well, this is like not a valuable stone. And after it just kind of stuck with me, like, what does it mean to be an old stone? Does that mean that there's such a thing as a new stone? And I've been trying to figure that out. So today I thought what we would do is just talk about old stones together. And obviously for the archaeologist in the context of that moment, let me share my screen here. The archaeologist wasn't talking about the age of the stone itself. They were talking about the association that stone had with a culture that that archaeologist was studying. And that's the way that we'd like to think about stones as vessels that communicate ideas about cultures that we could learn quite a bit from. So let's begin here. I'll give you a few moments to just land in this lunar site and try and figure out not only where you are, but what seems out of place. We have a low wall in this landscape. There's some loose rock in the foreground that looks like it could be rubble, could also be just fill. And that low wall is striking a somewhat horizontal line in the landscape, but it's bending a little bit. And on the far right, if I colorize the image, you'll see that there's one stone that feels quite out of place. I'll give you a little bit more context, is that this image was taken on a small Pacific island. And that one stone on the right is a volcanic tuff stone. The other stones are a dense basalt. That dense basalt is everywhere on the island. I mean, it's a massive resource. You can't really take a few steps without colliding with one of these stones. So to have this volcanic tuff stone, whose quarry is on the other side of the island, feels strange. It feels like a misstep. It feels like a mistake. And it's an enigma. It's curious. So if I give you a little bit more context, this image was taken of an ahu on Easter Island, actually Rapa Nui. And this is an image of the quarry where that same volcanic tuff stone is made essentially from the earth. So the moai of Rapa Nui are carved of this soft volcanic stone that you can almost scrape on, like a sandstone. And in this image of the quarry, you'll notice that the moai had been carved out horizontally and they are repositioned into this vertical stance as if they're ready to start making their way across the island. This image, we've all seen this image, but we don't think of the moai in this position. From the Western point of view, we think of this image of the statues lined up on their ahu at their final destination. Like, this is the moment that the artist intended for us to understand these statues. So from this Western point of view, we can look at the statues and analyze them for their proportions, the story they're telling through their figuration, their placement, and wonder about the idea that some artist and creator took the time to establish these permanent fixtures to convey some meaning throughout eternity. And we're here to figure out what that meaning is. But the reality is that the moai are not special at all on this island. This 14-mile wide island has over 900 moai, just like absolutely littering the landscape. And this particular ahu was reassembled in the 1980s for tourists. This next image here is a bit more indicative of what you would find on the island. This is on the north side of the island where roads don't make their way, so you have to take horseback. And the backside of this ahu looks very different from the other ahu. I'll just rewind for a second. We have these basalt stones that are lined up perfectly. One group was making constructions that look like this. And when you move to another side of the island where you have slightly different resources to work with, you end up with something more like this, a rubble fill strategy. Now, again, for some reason, and it's coincidental, it doesn't happen regularly, the far right stone of this ahu is also curious. And I'll zoom in on it, and you can see that that stone is actually itself a moai, this time carved out of the dense basalt stone, so it's smaller. And I think illustrates quite perfectly the idea that these moai were not special. They were just used as a resource and abandoned when they weren't needed. They're littered across the road, some of them face down, some of them on their backs. Some of them, as they fall over, their heads break off, and smaller little moai have been carved out of the heads. So it's kind of curious as if we think about this is a real head scratcher, because did the Rapa Nui just not value their heritage? Is this a form of conquest? We should know that the Rapa Nui were not a warring civilization, so this idea that you were like building on top of a previous civilization doesn't make any sense. That's really quite strange. When the Dutch explorers first encountered the island, they asked the people of Rapa Nui how their ancestors could have possibly moved these massive statues. And the Rapa Nui told them, our ancestors did not move those stones. The stones walked themselves. For centuries, this was dismissed as stone worship, but it turns out that the Rapa Nui were telling the truth and that the statues were transported standing, as we saw the image from the quarry, ready to walk, pivoting from side to side. As spectacular as the moai are for visitors today, you really have to imagine being there then at that moment with colossal moai marching around the island. Because the real memorial was not the objects themselves, it's the cultural ritual of bringing a stone to life. So as an architect, I've been chasing this dream of thinking about how we can shift some ideas of construction to begin to accommodate this mythical side. So I've been challenging myself, as Keith said, with putting on public performances of the really ancient, dumb, straightforward challenge of just getting big, heavy things to move and stand up. Like this 16-foot tall statue designed to walk across land and stand under the limited strength of a handful of graduate students at MIT. This terrestrial stone is repeated as an aquatic stone that floats horizontally under the bridges of the Charles River and drinks river water to stand vertically. Or this 4,000-pound behemoth that springs itself to life to dance on stage. Okay, so in testing this problem over and over, same exact problem, we're starting to think about the perception of life in the objects, but also about how humans engage with these inanimate beings. And I'm well aware I'm here as an architect speaking with people studying architecture, and everyone's probably wondering, great, but what does any of this have to do with architecture? And as I said before, we're just going to talk about old stones today. So bear with me. This is when everyone starts signing off and we go from 50 down to 20. But I'd like to break today's talk down into these three categories of just single stones, the assemblies of stones, and then bumping up to a larger scale of stone circles. So now we're transitioning slowly from the idea of a single stone to stone assemblies, because some of, in my opinion, the most spectacular pieces of architecture are composed themselves out of megaliths, which raise the stakes beyond transporting and placing any one of these massive stones into questions of assembly and construction logics. So more recently, we've been asking the question about how we can embed the behavior of assembly into the objects themselves to start to behave in a manner that they know what they would like to do. And we never do anything once, as you're probably starting to get the sense. So here, in what was a lab-based experiment now becomes a public performance, where we start to think about how we can really push the limits of offering an experience to an audience, which is in black in the background of this image, knowing that they're about to witness a spectacle, but not really quite knowing what that spectacle is going to be, and calibrating these pieces so that they do work in concert with each other. One of the challenges with these kinds of constructions is obviously the floor needs to be perfectly level, and you can see this like very thin attempt to try and make that platform work for us. But the other thing is that even the humidity in the space, fluctuations in humidity will move the center of mass just enough to change the behavior and the force of this collision. And there have been catastrophic failures as well, which are quite exciting. So if a brick is designed for a single hand to pick and place all day long, and a concrete masonry unit's designed for two hands to pick and place, the walking assembly project tries to decouple this assumption that labor is associated with picking and deadlifting objects, because anything above a CMU requires heavy lifting equipment to pick and place. So one of the things that's curious about engaging with these objects is that no matter how massive or small they are, they have embedded inertias. So this one in particular has so much inertia that you obviously cannot just like grab it and tell it where to go. You have to guide it into place. So slow and steady pressure that you start becoming a cooperative collaborator with the stone, something more like a dance partner, not like a construction worker. So this research initiative has challenged us to think about architecture beyond the results and to encompass the entire lifespan, from conception through transportation, assembly, as well as the afterlife, or at least raising questions about how we approach these practices today. And we did this through this very dumb exercise of just interrogating ritual, experience, theatricality, and play, topics that are not typically associated with construction. By embracing the myth that stones are alive, we're trying to reimagine construction, not as a site for labor, but as a site for wonder and whimsy. And as Keith mentioned in his introduction, this is really a counterculture to the practices that we perform today, especially in architecture, also in construction. I generally get the question about like, okay, that's interesting, but that's not how we build today. And that's absolutely right. It's not even close to the way that we build today. This is closer to the way that we're building today, with the majority of the world's population moving to urban centers. The vast majority of material that's housing that population is being cast out of reinforced concrete. Assumed to be a permanent material, this material does not last forever, not even close. The average building only lasts 30 to 60 years. So this begs the question, if we're casting at this unprecedented rate around the world, what on earth are we going to do with all these buildings? This concrete has no knowledge about this afterlife. The default solution is not to recycle concrete. And despite what greenwashing industries will tell you, the process of recycling concrete is extremely expensive and expends a lot of energy to grind up an intelligent material down, and you only retain the aggregate. And that aggregate is significantly downgraded in the process. You lose all of the intelligence of the cement and the binder. So in the end, what we're doing is we're landfilling our rubble. So as average Americans, you, as a hypothetical average American, that is, are depositing about a body bag of rubbish to landfills every month. And you're probably pretty aware of that because you see the trash that you're disposing and you don't know exactly where it goes in the end, but you know it's going to a landfill. You'd probably be surprised to learn that the building industry is contributing 2 more bags on your behalf. My position is that the building industry is currently addicted to new materials in an era that necessitates smarter practices. The concrete industry alone accounts for 8% of global CO2 emissions. And there's alarmingly little attention paid to the inevitable obsolescence of this material that we're casting. In the 1400s, Pope Nicholas V declared that the carcass of the Colosseum should be consumed to produce St. Peter's Basilica. And the Romans are not the only civilization that recognized the value of considering a building's afterlife. Cyclopean masonry baffles the mind with these complex patterns, but these cryptic formations are actually the result of cultures that invested in cannibalizing previous constructions and also selecting from random shapes and from loose rock falls. It seems like humans could not have possibly built these structures because they didn't. These structures were carefully crafted by a primordial race of giants, and we know of them as Cyclops. So I've been collaborating with these monsters to learn their secrets for moving those massive stones. And what we did as a research group is we contacted their family members and collected the recipes for these assemblies. We compiled those recipes into a cookbook that we called the Cannibal's Cookbook. Also, I see Ryan Luke Johns is on this call. Ryan's doing some really amazing research in a similar category. The goal of this work is really to just convey ancient practices that have resonance with topics of today. So here's an example of one of the recipes that we offer in the cookbook. There are 6 recipes, and I'll just take a moment and dig into some of the alternative ways of thinking that place value in these inevitable results. So for instance, here on the left is an image of one of these cryptic details that exist in Inca Cyclopean masonry. I will note that Cyclopean masonry, you can find it in many places around the world. There are examples on Easter Island, in Japan, in Egypt, in Northern Europe, in Russia. They're kind of scattered all around the world, but by far the Inca were the most prolific Cyclopean masons. The other term that's often used for it is polygonal masonry, dry stack masonry that doesn't conform to a kind of prefabrication of a masonry unit. So the way that brick masons work today, you can think of like receiving a material that's prefabricated in a standardized form, which is known as a brick, standardize as much as possible because they're going to be picking and placing bricks from left to right, coursing up, making sure that that coursing stays horizontal to the earth. You'll notice this wall that we traced on the right has these swags at a kind of even pacing and cadence across the wall. And those swags kind of collide with each other in the middle. It looks as if the wall has settled through time and that occasionally there's like foundations that are resisting this. However, if you get up close, you'll find that those stones are perfectly fit to each other. So this is the final destination of those stones. The important culture to understand that surrounds this stone construction is that the Quechua people paid their taxes to the Inca, or the ruling class, in the form of tribute labor. So you would find your best mason and send them to the Inca, who were kind of orchestrating public works projects, and say, okay, we need a retaining wall over here because we're going to start agriculture in this area. We need a wall, get to work. So in small groups, spaced out evenly, these masons would start working. They would set one stone in the middle that was a kind of like inverse keystone that was stable, like a trapezoid. And then they would start leaning up other stones on left and right. Think of it like a bookcase where you're really trying to balance books onto the center book. And as doing that, you're kind of making your way up because you want the pressure going back down to the center. As you make your way up, you're going to start colliding with the team to your right and the team to your left. And that's where you get these strange collisions, which produce these really intricate moments of collision. The other thing to know about Cyclopean masonry is that they're typically carved of hammerstones. So civilizations that were not using metal tools. The Inca actually, they didn't have a word for stone cutting. Their word translates as to nibble at stone. So it's a little bit closer to like sanding than it is to cutting. And that explains a bit of the kind of rounded character of these stones, but also just the absolute precise fit because they're sanding them. Now let's get into the mindset of thinking we're trying to construct a wall. There's a hole in the wall that we need to fill. This wall is being constructed out of random shapes, so we never have a perfectly horizontal line to set onto. We're gonna wanna try and find the biggest possible stone that can fill that hole. So let's make a template. Let's carry that template around. We're gonna run a search algorithm to see if we can find the stone that requires the least amount of carving. So we only have to move it once, right? So the value was not placed on the energy it would take to move big, heavy things into position. The value was placed on reducing the amount of search algorithm. So once you find that stone, you bring it over into place, you rough it out to the template. Somehow you levitate it above the spot that it needs to go. And here you can see this kind of problem because you're setting the stones on top of, in the middle, the Utah detail. You're setting the stones, as I said, on top of random shapes. So you never really have a horizontal bed joint. So you have to carve and translate the bottom geometry of the floating stone onto the top of the stones below. And once that is carved and translated, you can seat that down. So because we're using ice and levers to slowly drop these stones and raise them into position, you really want to make sure that the sides are opened up a little bit, like the keystone of an arch. We call this draft, so that you're not grinding the edges to try and get it down into position. And that draft was just incredibly valuable for us in analyzing these Cyclopean masonry walls, because you can tell when that draft shifts in interpolation from one positive to the negative, you'll know the sequence with which this wall was put together. And as you start to analyze the sequence, you can understand the logics of these is that they're not really working from left to right. They're working from center out and then filling in the collisions. And with that analysis, we as a research group are obviously leveraging the myths and stories that hold some truths embedded in them about ancient primordial giants known as Cyclops that constructed these walls that baffled the contemporary mind, to really try and transform the contemporary building industry. So we published this. I'm really happy to say that the Cannibal's Cookbook is being published by Oro Editions. It's coming out in just a few months. It's been sold out from its first limited edition for at least a year now. But at the same time, we make this knowledge, we try and communicate it to others and publish that information. But we always prototype these pieces ourselves. And here is that wall at the Seoul Biennial. You can see it's aggregated of a random selection of stone types. There's basalt, there's limestone, there's concrete from a Motel 6 in Madison, Wisconsin. So we ran the search algorithm. There's kind of two things that are happening in the background with the computation. One of the things is the nesting algorithm that's trying to figure out the most optimal configuration that would minimize the amount of cutting. So we're using automation techniques of digitally scanning these offcuts from the stone industry and rubble from construction sites to try and find the most intelligent way of reassembling them into something new. Now, something that's really important to know about this is that the concrete no longer requires the intelligence of the rebar. Rebar is really there as reinforced concrete. It's one of the reasons why reinforced concrete has a mortality date associated with it, because as concrete carbonates, it destroys the rebar. So after about 100 years or 150 years, it no longer functions unless you're really maintaining it. The only way you can get concrete to function longer than 150 years is to operate in compression only, right? So there's a reason why the Pantheon is still standing. So this, the other thing that's happening in the background of this computation analysis is a solver-based computation that's increasing and decreasing the depths of the backs of these stones so that we can ensure that it's a compression-only structure. There is a story about this wall that is really quite baffling and mysterious that I can talk about when we get to the question and answer phase in a bit. But I think this image is kind of indicative of the way that we like to work at Matter Design, which is to experiment with things at full scale, to test them out for ourselves, to try and speculate about what they could offer and communicate to others. And at the same time, trying to package information that is diligent and shares knowledge with others. So the goal is obviously that this practice doesn't end at this wall. So we're trying to focus on reshaping the direction of building practices by operating in two fields, knowledge and practice. Okay, so let me try and transition a little bit to this next project. It's not a perfect transition, but something I can, if I were to analyze this one particular project, I would say that like the demonstration wall on Rapa Nui that I was talking about before with the single tooth stone on the far right. By the way, I think you probably figured it out, but that tooth stone was originally a moai that didn't keep its figure. It was carved from a moai into a block, even though they had other resources that they could also carve into blocks, although the tooth is much easier to carve than the basalt. So that stone had information about moving from one site to another. The thing that's interesting for me about this, although it makes no sense with the climate change argument that we're making, is that all of these stones originated in Madison, Wisconsin, and they made it their way to Seoul, Korea for not much money. Like the shipment to send by boat was much less than it cost for us to fly over to Korea somehow. Where was I going with this? Okay, so what I was trying to say is that I see this project as a demonstration of an idea. I don't necessarily see it as a project that we designed ourselves. Obviously, we worked on the algorithm, but we relinquished quite a bit of authorship to try and make decisions about how you communicate this idea, working with the stonemasons to make decisions of their own. And obviously the algorithm is running its own optimization, which takes away some of our control. So I think this question of control is the thing that I'm quite curious about, because our goal here in this project is to think about the afterlife of buildings that have already died, right? Like, here's a building, here's some rubble from that building. What could we do with that rubble? But at the same time, if we could argue, hey, the building industry needs to start thinking about the afterlife of buildings, I would argue that architects ourselves, we need to start thinking about the afterlives of the things that we're producing. So as a design challenge, we've been trying to think about how we could experiment with some of those issues. The site for this project is the US-Mexico border. There's this curious bit of land called Chamisal, or El Chamisal, that is smack dab in the middle of El Paso and Juarez. So Ciudad Juarez is usually considered like its own city and El Paso is another, but as you can see from this map, it's really one community that has a border cutting straight through it. And then you have the Rocky Mountains coming down from the north, the Sierra Madres coming up from the south. It's a central sacred destination for the Native Americans as well. But the Chamisal is this strange political bafflement, because the Rio Grande River in the early 1900s decided that it was going to meander, and it moved the border. So it moved the border from the south side to the north side. And that produced a problem because you have this kind of no man's land that's roughly the size of Central Park in New York. So this project for us is a collaboration with a social programmer that offers events, everything from like dinner parties up to giant 1,000-person audiences for the Pope on this destination. So they asked us, along with a number of other collaborators, to think about how we could provide a space that would be malleable and accommodating of the various programs that they put on. So we have a perfectly flat site adjacent to the border wall. Here's a plan of the first configuration. It snaps into one line, and 3 colossal elements can pivot. And our goal in the design process is to think about how we can craft these elements to be playful enough that they're engaging, while also variable enough to provide as many possible programs as we can get out of it. And that was the way that we were evaluating the design decisions that we were making about the proportions, the scale, the distance between these elements, and how we can start to define as many different possible spaces without resorting to confining the space. So architecture, for lay people, I guess architecture is usually considered to be an enclosure. And we were trying to think about how we could create a hearth that would radiate space around it so that you could also sort of borrow from the existing landscape in the modernist sense, I guess. And here's an elevation of a Key. Just kind of speculating on how it could possibly be used. Obviously, as architects, we've been thinking about different programs that they could use it. I think it's fair to say that there are other programs that could be developed and thought of in association with a key. So it's kind of two-part problem. It's like we're inheriting certain programs from the quote unquote client, but at the same time, we're trying to place an instantiation to cultivate other ideas. Like how could artists come and intervene on this site? How could chefs come and engage and think about building community? So this is a project that we're really hoping to build soon, and renderings never really satisfies me. So the energy behind engaging these elements, I'm really looking forward to being able to feel what it's like to be next to these things, because they're also designed to retain heat and energy. There's as you can see, there's a hearth in there for the chefs to cook food. Okay, moving on to the last category, stone circles. And when I say stone circles, most people think of Northern Europe. Stonehenge is obviously one of these stone circles, but I think this is part of a lineage throughout mankind where humans have been marking the earth at a colossal scale, oftentimes producing imagery that you can only really understand from above. So while you're in, for instance, a crop circle of the 1980s, you're never really quite sure if you're getting it right. Drones didn't exist at the time. They often happened in the middle of the night, so hot air balloons. I mean, there's kind of no idea other than just absolute rigor about instructions and dimensions and string. So string is the most important vehicle to this form of computation because as people visit stone circles of Northern Europe, we call them stone circles, but actually they're more like rings. They're never really precise, pure circles mathematically. They have these kind of deformed geometries. And to me, it feels reminiscent of that swag wall that we were just talking about from the Inca. It seems like the earth, like these things were just constructed so many years ago that the earth has been, I guess, moving through time and starting to deform these rings, because obviously they could have gotten the circle right. But Alexander Thom was able to prove that these were never intended to be perfect circles. They were much more complex geometries that were produced out of string. Here are a few diagrams of how that works. But these complex geometries help strike alignments with celestial bodies. And obviously, we know many of these observatories are there to start to think about how ritual and ideas of bringing culture together around problems of just trying to figure out what day of the year it is, right? So we've been asking, like, how could we take some of that knowledge and produce, like, what would a contemporary stone observatory look like today? Who would use it? What would it be for? And this is our stone circle. This is for the Grayson School in Radnor, Pennsylvania. The Grayson School is a really interesting school. They do project-based learning with gifted students. This playground is particularly designed for adolescent students, so middle school and high school. You'll notice that it has a pure north-south alignment, and at the south end of that axis, there's a very tall stone. At the north end, there's a lower flat tabletop-like stone. To the left of that, there's something off axis striking a diagonal, which is like a bench, and it itself lands on an axis that identifies what's called a ground anchor to the far left. And you'll see there are 5 of these ground anchors, and if I move to the elevation of the project, you can see those ground anchors are really, they're just flush with the top of the soil. You can also see the character of these individual stones, and they kind of suggest certain alignments with each other. They kind of know about each other, but they're just missing a lot of information. And they have these curious details. So something important to know about the Grayson School is that the students have access to a shop, they have a CNC machine, and they build things for their education. So there are receivers that can adopt standard dimensional lumber like 2x4s, 2x6s. And the idea is that these basic elements are structured not only to think about creating curiosity for the students, but to serve as anchors for the experiments that will take place as part of their education. Okay, so before I describe this a bit more, I'm gonna try and stay in Rapa Nui with us today a little bit, because this is a dance paddle. It's not the only dance paddles. This one happens to be at the Met, but there are many dance paddles from Rapa Nui. This is, for me, a very curious object, because the Rapa Nui were a Polynesian culture that made their way to Easter Island, or also known as Rapa Nui, self-described. And obviously they were using paddles. They were a seafaring group. And then when they became land laden, this paddle acquired a tail so that it knew how to stand on the ground, and it also became a head on one end. So we have this single object that at one end has a utilitarian function associated with it, and at the other end, it's like equal parts utility and ceremony. So in living between those two worlds, people start to acquire an imagination about how this is used, why it's important. And as a design exercise, we started to think about how we could craft our own version of this and create a series of elements that would be at one end utilitarian, and that the students could actually use them. They're carved out of plywood. But at the other end, start to have suggestive behaviors about relationships between the elements themselves, as well as to the body. One of the ways we made decisions about the design of these glyphs, as well as the play lab that they engage with, is that we always wanted to take the design about 90% of completion without giving the solution away, so that there is always a bit of curiosity about whether they've got it right. So the point of this play lab is actually that the design decisions are developed in concert with the teachers of the school. So over the course of these students' education, they'll be challenged to unpack the mysteries that are embedded in these concrete objects. I think without giving anything away in an open lecture like this, I think things as simple as the north-south alignment of the elements starts to suggest an idea that these students can be using things that they're learning in math, like trigonometry, to make observations, to make speculations and projections, while also learning about history and the other kind of cross-curricular design exercises that the teachers take place. So the play lab is not in this kind of early childhood idea of play, which is like swings and slides and playgrounds in that sense. It's really about captivation of curiosity and engaging education as part of that process. So the play lab for us is a great collaboration with educators to start to think about how design can challenge new structures of progressive education. But really, it's a project that is an infrastructure at one school so that these students are benefiting from this piece. And how can we convey the potentials of that education model to other students? So at the same time, we're doing another research project. And this is kind of like, we're getting to the less fully baked version of the lecture. So this is actually active research at the moment. But the Crop Circle Kit is an initiative to offer information about string-based computation. So you have the kind of base algorithms of how you can create an ellipse with string, how you can find parallel lines, which is no trivial task if you just have string in a massive landscape. So the goal of what we're trying to do is we've been putting on a series of workshops with students producing artwork out of things as rigorous as computation, string, getting out into the field, making things at a massive scale. And we put together a website called the Crop Circle Kit. You can go to cropcirclekit.org and check out some of the content that's there. We're building it at the moment, but you'll see some animations that talk about these geometries. You'll also see some analysis of precedents to talk about like what are the cultures that surround certain types of these geoglyphs, as well as some context about how you could manifest one of these yourself. And in the fall during COVID, we sent around a little kit, which is how you can make drawings at your desk. So the idea behind these workshops is that students at middle school and high school, so secondary education, are receiving these kits. They're working with the information from the website to understand how they can do certain basic geometric methods and producing drawings at their desk. While they produce those drawings, they're writing down instructions adjacent to the drawing. And after they've completed the drawing, they hand those instructions to someone else and they see if one of their classmates can reproduce the drawing. So the secret behind this is like, obviously this is an activity, it's a project, but the students are learning computation without ever touching a computer. So these are some of the results that we visualized from the code that the students sent us back. And it's been really exciting. We're trying to launch this research and we're going into a second phase at the moment and kind of building out the resources. But I wanted to take a moment and just talk about how are we doing on time. This is good. Okay, just wrapping up. So the personal story here is that I was honestly an average public school student. And it's not lost on me that I'm now a professor at a school that I had absolutely no chance of being accepted to MIT out of high school. So it wasn't until I found architecture that I even realized my value in the world. I just want to, talking architects to architects, students, educators, like our approach as architects to project, to work with like project-based learning melts imagination and reality with rigor and creativity in ways that really would have felt alien to me in my secondary education. It probably feels natural to us now, but I think the challenge that I'm trying to think about is like, how can we introduce these ideas to lower levels of education and not wait until college? So scholars and educators agree on the value of play in education, but they also point to this really sharp decline in play in recent years, especially in middle and high school levels. And the problem is we're working under this very naive assumption that to increase play, we have to displace learning. You know, like this idea that, yes, play is great, so let's increase recess time. As if recess is some frivolous activity that happens out in the playground and learning is a serious endeavor that occurs essentially through memorization in the classroom. But at the same time, meanwhile, architects are over here like we do this every day. So the question I have at the moment is, how do we effectively introduce playful approaches of architectural education into middle and high school students, or into the education of these students? And that's the mission of the Crop Circle Kit. So this is the brand new research that we're working on at the moment. And just to wrap up, today we've been exploring these various scales of ancient stone construction. And just to return to the story about the old stone that cracked, this isn't about the stones themselves, obviously. It's about the cultures and practices that surround these enigmas. The stones are just vehicles to communicate alternative approaches that are transcending time. They challenge us to think differently about topics like labor, energy, and even education. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Brandon. That was really impressive. And I've seen your work before, and to see like the crop circles, obviously I was not aware of. Something newer that you're cooking up, but incredibly inspiring talk. We will open the floor now to questions. So I'm going to go to my gallery view. Just feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or if you want to type the question in the chat, if you prefer that we read it out of the chat, that's fine too. Anyone? I mean, I can always jump in, but my questions are probably the least relevant because I'm like one of the oldest. So here, I'll pose this question, and
You're an old stone, Keith.
I am an old, immovable stone. But maybe I can be nibbled at to kind of, be reshaped to fit into a rubble wall. The last project, Brandon, really like brings I think some of the experimental pedagogy I see that you do at MIT with your grad students, but brings it into primary school. And but you didn't present, which I totally understand, some of that pedagogical research you've been doing at MIT. But could you maybe speak to that and how notions of performance and connecting the body to material practices and space making and shape making, inform your work, and how your work with the old stones actually informs your pedagogy?
Right. Yeah. You did mention that, and I didn't follow through on the connection with pedagogy. I think the Crop Circle Kit, by the way, it did start at the graduate level. I taught a workshop at MIT last spring that got shut down with COVID, and then we went virtual, and we did a kind of micro exercise here. And then I've also taught a series of workshops at like undergraduate level. So the final video you were seeing was done at LSU. And then we also we're trying to make our way down, because it's actually much more difficult for me to jump from graduate education to middle school students. So that is actually the bigger leap. Graduate students, like my mom says, like great students are easy to teach. My mom was a second grade teacher, and she tells me all the time that I don't know what I'm doing when I'm talking about education. But the honest truth is, like, essentially the way that I approach education at MIT is really trying to bring cross-disciplinary approaches to challenge architecture. So there are some kind of fundamental things that we deal with as architects that can be displaced as soon as you ask someone to perform it live. So the assumption that we make things that last forever, I think, is one of the things that I'm trying my best to knock down. By the way, I teach Core 1, which is the first studio entering into architecture. And I think it's easier to think of it as foundations of design and not architecture itself, because when you label it with architecture, it becomes laden with disciplinary assumptions. So as an approach to education, typically what I'm doing is I'm bringing in other disciplines. So we bring in collaborators that deal with like character development and cartoons. We've also brought in live performers to think about how they talk through time-based issues, composers as another example. And as soon as you ask people to associate something to something as simple as just design an experience for 20 minutes, when you offer a time as opposed to square feet or program, your thought process gets inverted. And there's this sort of zone that I like to think of as the playful zone, which is where you have to do things that are realistic and rigorous. At the same time, they should be imaginary. So the goal in the education strategy is always to be able to evaluate students' projects based on a balance between those two things. And I think you can kind of see that effort in the crop circle kit as well.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
see Adam has his hand up. Is he?
I do.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Adam.
Oh, hey. Did that work? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I do have my hand up, Brandon. It's great to see you.
I don't know. I don't think I'm supposed to be emceeing here, but can I, Keith, is that okay?
Everything's okay.
Thanks for this great talk, Brandon. It's awesome to see the work. I had a kind of like practice question, which might be a little boring, but I think could be interesting for students as well. And it's really thinking about like how have you been able to align your research agenda, which, you know, at first hearing about ancient megaliths and prehistoric stone assemblages and so on, like might seem a bit esoteric. How you've been able to kind of align that with like what's increasingly like more client-driven practice work, which I think is amazing. Like in the Border project in Juarez, and then also in the Play Lab project, and what you're doing now with the string-based computation work. And it seems like, I don't know, I just think it's like a really interesting challenge that all of us, grapple with, like how to kind of walk that fine line between the research work and then finding, clients who I'm sure, both of those projects in Mexico and at the school must have like really complex constituencies and demands, and how you find a way to kind of reconcile that.
Yeah, I think the distinction I should make here is that we don't have clients. There are actually no clients. So these are research projects and they're collaborators that we're working with. So for instance, with the school, it's not like the school funded the project and said, hey, we need this. So it was a research initiative that dealt with grant work to fund the research that manifested into a project that we're using. And that's really a 3-year-long research project to see how creativity develops within the school. A key project also at the U.S.-Mexico border. As I mentioned, I mean, it sounds like there's a client because there's a group, a nonprofit that puts on these events, and they own the property. However, the project was developed actually originally with a collaborator, Sarah Sandman. She was also a TED Fellow, and Sarah's been doing this project called Brick by Brick, where they dress women up in these outfits that are in the shape of bricks, and they produce these walls of like feminism against Trump, essentially. So it's a protest activism, like how you can merge design and protest together to make a statement. And Sarah and I met each other, and she has a collaborative, PDA collaborative, and they were thinking about how we can engage communities, not just as a form of protest, but as a way of like giving something, offering something as well through design. We also have a collaborative research project going on with Cemex Global R&D. This is the building industry. Cemex is a massive corporation. And then there's this nonprofit. So this is a group of people, and we create these projects. Like no one comes to us and says, hey, we want a big stone that walks. Like absolutely no one has asked for this stuff. So for me, the challenge is not in trying to like thread the needle and get the things to work together, but the amount of time it takes to convince other people that this weird thing that I'd like to try and test, like, yeah, I'd like to do a crop circle, and like we do need funding to be able to work on it. Because in the end, you never really know the mission statement. Like, you kind of think you do, but until you actually start experimenting with these things, I'll say that when we made the first megalith, okay, let me give that. I know I'm talking quickly and a lot, but just give a timeline. So there's a book called The Statues That Walked by Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo. They're archaeologists. They're the archaeologists that, I'll type this in the chat, I guess. The Statues That Walked. It's an incredible book. This work was published in 2012. I think the paper was published where they were able to prove that the Moai walked. Even though the Rapa Nui had been on the island telling everyone this for over 100 years. That happened in 2012. The megalith that we made at MIT that traveled to CCA happened in 2015. So three-year gap between me hearing like, okay, well, that's actually really interesting. I'd love to just make one. And like that is as straightforward and as dumb as that project was at the moment. But now, like, having done it over and over again, it's starting to raise questions about labor and energy, fossil fuels, and challenging the other future work that comes. So I think for me at the moment, I'm less interested in trying to thread the needle with client-based work than I am trying to figure out how to stitch research back to education, which was Keith's first question. And I think that's still undercooked because I have methods that I know how to teach architects foundations of design, but I'm trying to really take advantage of the things that I'm working on at the same time and see how that can influence education. And it's a work in progress.
And then Chris, you have a question, or you have your hand raised?
Hey, yeah, I have almost less of a question. Sort of, you brought up the point. Wonder if you could speak on. You brought up the point of kind of like discussing these monolithic, these stones that have been around forever, that kind of have lasted, and how you know, obviously architecture as space that relates to people as space, how that also works with time. I kind of like was considering, you know, new construction, you see maybe some kind of like metal paneling that's really popular right now, and in 3 years it's all dinged and kind of like has to be replaced or doesn't look good, yet stones that have been around for millennia that are just as gorgeous as maybe the day they were created, how that kind of relates to like modern appeals to less resource use, like you spoke about reusing concrete. Kind of like if you could just speak, maybe expand more on any of the research you've done in that department. I find that kind of interesting as it like our species tries to like grapple with expansion while also like limited resources.
Right. That's a really great question. That makes me think about this. Ron Real and I were both on a panel at industry conference on concrete that we were like the supposed concrete experts on this panel, but there was this kind of after show interview that was clearly being broadcast, I think, on like HGTV or something like that. So you imagine the shift of like the academic research that Ron and I operate with all of our collaborators to okay, now let's talk about this for the broad audience. So the conversation shifted to like a mic in front of Ron asking, what do you see as the trend of whatever year it was, 2012 in concrete? What will the trend be? And I think Ron said something like, I think color will be the trend. And then they took the microphone away and he just immediately turned to me and goes, I should not have answered that question, you know. But this I think what you're talking about is the kind of the temporal fashioning of like things that are like constantly changing. So there's a time scale that if you shrink the time scale, you could say if we're only talking about something that lasts 20 minutes, for instance, we're talking about a performance that should be an experience and then kind of disappear and should never happen again. Like you either needed to be there or not there. But when you repeat it, all of a sudden, that brings up other questions. This is something that musicians, composers, performers, they're obviously thinking about these in ways that are much more nuanced than architects are. My issue with architects is that we are so stuck in the 30-year mortgage that everything we build is just assuming it's 30 years. So like the shingles we put on our roofs have a 30-year warranty, and you'll have to redo the seals in maybe 35 years or something like that. But it sets a mortality to the architecture. And at the same time, when we're creating things, we're just assuming they're lasting forever. So I think that's the thing that I want to kind of break down. The other side of this is that I've always found buildings way more fascinating when they're still under construction. And when they finally close off, like all the imagination is gone, and I start picking apart, like, oh, that detail's kind of rough, or, I would have done it a different way. But when it's still in progress, something feels much more captivating. And I think at a kind of like gut level, this is probably what Lou Kahn was thinking when he had the romantic ideas of ruins. And it's just the kind of inverse logic of like, imagine what was, imagine what could be. So there's kind of multiple, like there's no like one line, which is like time. There are just so many different bubbles of ways of thinking about time to challenge us. So as I was trying to break down like design decisions that we make with like the Cyclopean cannibalism wall, where we're trying to de-author as much as possible, that helps you make decisions. I mean, let me do it. Let me say it this way. As architects, we love to work with concepts. Concepts help us make decisions about designs that we're developing. I'm not the first to say this, but there's the lowercase project, the uppercase project, and then there's the all caps project. A lowercase project is an individual project that you're working on. So the Cyclopean cannibalism wall is a lowercase project. And when you're doing that, you can work with a concept to make certain decisions. And I like to think about a single time frame. Like this project is a performance, so the time is this, and therefore the decisions that we're making are based on X, right? When you go up to the uppercase project level, you're starting to encapsulate a series of different projects. And the decisions that you make at the capital P project level generally have to do with contrast. Like I'm bringing different projects together, but I'm trying to exercise it over here in this one project, and then I'm going to come over here and exercise it there, and like come at a problem from a few different points of view. So it's not necessarily concept at that level, it's position. And time is one of those things that I try and flex as much as possible. So on one end, it's like, let's do something that should last as long as possible. And then the next project we do in this trajectory, we should try and make it last as short as possible. Like it should disappear when it's done. So time for me is not necessarily like a solution. Like it's not like I'm saying, hey, things should last longer or things should last shorter, but it's one of the tools that we have at our disposal to really interrogate the problems that we're working on. Then at the top of that, I'll just kind of do this very quickly, but I'm thinking the all caps project for me has more to do with method. So for me, the method is like, it's very straightforward. I take ancient knowledge, I try and extract it, learn something from experimenting with it today, and then offering that knowledge to other people. So you could see that same method deployed in every single, like the lowercase p, all of them down below. I'm always doing that, I think. And then I'm trying to figure out how those projects have things to do with each other. So that is a kind of like structural way of describing the question that you had to do with time, but I hope that is useful.
Absolutely, thank you. I mean, major stonework is ancient and powerful, and in stark opposition to modern cheap construction.
Yeah, and also there's like perception associated with that. So the moai on Rapa Nui, like they just look really old because they were volcanic tooth, but they were carving moai up until the early 1900s. Okay, that is pretty, like, as far as the age of a stone, it's pretty new, like on the archaeological spectrum. And then there are stone circles in Armenia that are at like 10,000 years old, and they do look old, right? But it's yes, I'll leave it there.
Anyone else have a question or comment?
I have a question.
Go ahead,
Hi,
Claire.
Claire.
Hi. I was kind of wondering how you imagine the afterlife of some of the kind of big concrete sculptural things you're making, because you were talking about the afterlife of concrete a lot. And then I was also thinking about how you would even predict kind of what the future needs of certain things like that would be in your work.
Hmm. Right. So I mentioned there was a story about the wall in Seoul, and I think there are lots of contradictions in our work, and there are lots of backstories that just don't make any sense. Like the fact that we fabricate this thing in Madison, Wisconsin, and ship it to Seoul, and then at the end of it, it's like, well, what are we going to do with it? Because it is designed to stand forever. It's a compression only structure, and a few months later, we got an image that it had collapsed. But it had collapsed. I mean, I think Ryan, you may have seen this image, but it collapsed in a very strange way. It's like one of the stones on the top was like set on its side, like 30 feet away, and then some other ones kind of fell to the side. And we're like, that's really strange because they had steel pins in them. Like it couldn't just fall over. Then we found out that the crane operator that we were working with was never paid by the Biennale. And we started trying to figure out like, well, okay, so some other mystery happened. We still don't know what happened with that piece, but it did land in the landfill in the end. That's the honest truth of it. So I'll give, there's another thing that happened. At MIT, we have what's called a hacking culture where the students do these strange things where they'll take a police car and they'll put it on top of the dome. Every year they do something different. And we brought the Janus piece from Europe to MIT. Janus is the big wobble, the one with the ring, with the dancer and the composers. And we brought that to MIT to put on a performance. And I got a call from a police officer saying that there's some weird concrete sculpture in the middle of a lawn. And I drove over there very quickly and found that the students had taken it out of the crate and just rolled it across the campus, smashing into some of the buildings. And it's like a wrecking ball thing, you know, and they could have very easily hurt themselves. So they thought that the piece was a hack. So this Janus piece, which was designed to kind of like land at MIT without any knowledge, has a story associated with it, which was not designed or intended by us at all. So I'm not really answering your question, but one of the things that I am trying to think about is not only how we can work with existing structures and think about methods and procedures for giving them afterlives, but placing the seed that the buildings that you construct today will be dismantled or they will be demolished. So what you know, every once in a while I'll hear someone say, no, buildings do last much longer than 30 or 60 years. But you know, you should really tell Detroit that, because Detroit has a huge problem. They can't demolish enough buildings. Like there are too many buildings for the inhabitants, and demolition is one possible solution. So the kind of warning anecdote that I'll give to end this answer is that there was a parking structure that was built at MIT in the 1970s. And at that time, MIT was pretty progressive, and it said, we shouldn't have cars coming to campus years from now. So we're going to design the structure to last for 30 years, and then it should be dismantled. And it's designed to be taken back apart and remantled somewhere else, wherever it needs to be. And yet no one had the institutional knowledge to tell the facilities group that 60 years later, when they actually decided to dismantle it and replace it with an energy plant. So what they did was they demolished it and they turned it into rubble and they sent it to landfills. And we don't landfill concrete in Massachusetts. So instead we ship it to Ohio. So I guess my answer is like, there are just terrible practices surrounding materials that don't know that they're bad. So as long as we acknowledge this and start to think about like, how would you design something so that no matter what, you didn't have to have the instruction manual, that you knew, hey, this thing needs to be taken apart and it can have a second life associated with it. So that would be one challenge that I would put out there.
I think that's it. That's such a, Desan has a question, but just on that note, Brandon, it's so interesting to think about. I can't picture this parking garage you're talking about, but clearly it wasn't designed to tell people that it could be dismantled, right? So that wasn't encoded actually in the architecture itself.
Yeah. Right.
It's like losing your manual for a piece of furniture you build, and then you go to move and you're like, how did I put this together? Right? You can't even remember that. But and I just want to throw these out and then let Desan ask his question. But I'm so curious about like how notions of maintenance may or may not come into play in your thinking about these projects, right? Because that 30-year or whatever the lifespan of a building is also has to track maintenance operations and protocols, right? A building can last longer depending on maintenance protocols.
Absolutely.
Whether those are available as legible information in the building, right? Versus expert information. That it's often expert information that maintains the building. And then the other thing are questions of themselves. I mean, the work is so much about the labor of performance and the body in relation to mass in your work, but labor as it connects to the way we make our architecture, both politically and from an energy perspective. And those aren't questions, they're just observations. So Desan, you have a question.
I was curious on what are some access points for students to engage in your work that's not at MIT, like ways that we can follow your research or engage with you in like a pedagogical way. Just curious if that exists.
Well, one thing I'll say is my website, matterdesignstudio.com. We do publish all of our, like when we publish things, we also make it accessible on there. The Crop Circle Kit is, we're hoping to make that a kind of central resource to build a community around education practices. And eventually we would love to have like distributed workshops so that there are curriculum, there are exercises that you could just take and say like, hey, this is a school, yeah, really at any level. Like, I think that this is something that obviously at the moment we're targeting middle and high school students, but you could also picture it as family activities or with cultural organizations, museums, putting on family events. So we want to try and build content that you could be able to absorb, and especially for teachers, like right now with distance learning, to be able to hit the standard targets that George W. Bush instantiated into our education model of No Child Left Behind. They're like, they've got all these check boxes that they got to say like, okay, I dealt with this today, I did this tomorrow. So the goal would be like a central resource where you could download that content and say like, okay, you'll check these boxes if you do this exercise, which is a half-hour exercise. So I think that's one way of possibly engaging. And we give workshops every once in a while. I guess those things I would be advertising on the website.
Well, and maybe Brandon, we can well, I don't know now that there will be an after COVID times, but COVID acceptance, it'd be really wonderful to have you come out to San Francisco. And
I would love to.
Imagine, so Brandon has exhibited work as part of the Designing Material Innovation show 2 years ago, I guess more, probably 4 years ago, in the back lot. But I can imagine like doing some and I guess we could play with your Crop Circle app ourselves here.
Yeah.
Present, but it'd be wonderful to find a way to bring you out to experiment a little bit and play in the back lot or play in the building.
We're game.
I rely on all the students on this call to remind me that I said that. Joey.
Hey, Joey.
Wow, it's been a while.
Hey, how's it going?
Good to see you.
Yes. Good to see you as well. Thanks for sharing this. It was fun to drop in while I'm working and listen in.
Nice.
Maybe some of the bright side of being able to be connected in this way. I was curious about the screenshots that you shared of the Crop Circle Kit as an app. And I was wondering if those were aspirational or if that is being developed. and how you are bringing your kind of architectural and this pedagogical educational mindset to that type of design space.
Yeah, I mean, it is an actual, it is a website. So the screenshots I was showing were images of the website, but I'm going to say that it's really like in the seed research level of like, we're building the infrastructure. So we have just the beginnings of content. Like you'll see parallel lines, tangent lines, perpendicular lines, circles, ellipses, compound ellipses, spirals, things like that. But we don't yet have the exercises, the things that I was talking about, which are like, how could you hit standard targets? These are the methods that you would use in the classroom. This is how long it would take. And one of the challenges, so as we move into hopefully the second round of this research, one of the challenges that we found in the first proof of concepts is that just the class time was a constraint in secondary education. Of like, by the time you go out into a field, do something, and then pack it back up and go back in, the 45-minute class period is over, right? So you kind of spend no time. One of the things that we're thinking would be really helpful would be to work with augmented reality, so that students could like develop things, save them, return to them the next day, share them with other people, but also like I'll get into some of the more complex ideas of computation, but like to be able to deal with even just parametrics of like scale, like as simple as like scaling things. Like I'm going to do this at my desk, and then I can go out into a field and inhabit it, and understand like now I'm going to align it to magnetic north. I mean, that's something that I think will be more broadly distributable than a physical kit that we couldn't possibly get to everyone in the world. So that's kind of where our energy is moving, is away from the idea of a physical kit, especially because we can't fabricate anything. The crop circle kit is the result of COVID, by the way, where you were like, okay, we can't do our fabrication work. Let's shift over and start doing animations. Let's make drawings. And that's one positive that came out of it. But by the way, McKinsey is the one that produced those renderings.
Nice. That's great. Yeah, I think just to respond really quick, I think the idea of it existing in augmented reality as in the space of an app is a really fascinating one too, especially like I'm just looking at the website now, the way that the drawings manifest, and they have a certain kind of tactility to them that draws one to want to interact with them as well. And so I think that might be an interesting space for the project to really take on, is that space of AR and interaction through the devices.
So this is an interesting segue. I can see Ryan has his hand up, because for me, augmented reality, like Wes, Joe, and I, like when we created Matter Design, we were thinking like this should be something, we're not a virtual practice. Everything we do, we want to build ourselves, and we have been doing that. And as I said, I don't like renderings, but augmented reality for me always felt like something a little bit like I shouldn't touch it. I gotta stay with materials. And yet at the same time, you know, like the readings that I deal with are like archaeology readings and play, like psychology, play studies. And this idea that you could be between imagination and reality at the same time is, I think for me now, I'm coming around to the idea of play. But I wanted to just bring Ryan into this, because Ryan gave in Berlin one of the best lectures I've ever seen, which was like this critique of the augmented reality world that was dealing with the placement of bricks. And I loved it, Ryan. So I think you pushed me over the edge to feel positive to augmented reality. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, maybe unrelated to that, I have to apologize. Firstly, thank you very much to CCA for making this public. I saw last minute Brandon posted the link, and as always, it was very much worth the time. So you know, thank you for delivering always such optimistic and kind of well thought out and yeah, positive work. But yeah, I wasn't going to necessarily talk about augmented reality. I mean, I think that it's good that you saw something positive on that, because I think that work was very much about you know, in short, the project was like, you're building a a brick wall in VR, and you get these kind of prompts that tell you where to put a block. And you pick up a block and you put it there, and you actually physically move enough blocks to build like a Grammacia Kohler type brick wall. But what's happening in the background is the robot is moving back the block that you've placed every time. So you don't realize that you're just moving the block onto the robot to a different position each time. And that, I think that the idea there was that, and so you take off your headset and you've like done all this labor, but there's no work, there's no kind of physical object associated with it. And I think that, much like Brandon's work, there's this kind of question with these new technologies about, what is the role of labor as we get machines helping us to build things and virtual design tools. And I think that what's really nice about Brandon's work is this kind of effort to look into how do we kind of protract that design exercise into something that engages as many people in a kind of participatory act. And I guess that actually leads maybe to my question, which had more to do with the kind of like origin story of materials. I think that one of my favorite things about your Cyclopean Cannibalism book is this like little section in the end where you talk about where the paper came from and what fonts you used and stuff. And I think this is something that's very typically done in the kind of world of graphic design, but in architecture, I think we often try to kind of erase as much of the backstory and present this kind of polished narrative of like, after the fact, you post-rationalize everything to being this like brilliant thing. And I think that the really nice thing about the way that you present your work is an honesty about how these things unfold and the kind of non-linearity of those narratives and how they help things work. But that leads to my question, which is like, I kind of wondered through your presentation, the title being Old Stones, and there's so much concrete in it. Do you kind of think of stone and concrete as the same thing, that they produce hard objects? Or is like, do you imagine in your work, maybe through this augmented reality or through these field guides, giving people instructions about how to find the rocks? Like my wife's from Illinois, they don't really have rocks there. People actually steal rocks from other people's lawns because big rocks just aren't really in nature as much. And so you couldn't really apply this kind of megalithic approach in certain areas. And so concrete is this nice thing in that, you can kind of send someone a mold or send them the CNC file for a mold, and then they can reproduce something. I wonder, like, in that way, then concrete becomes a kind of more globally found rock. And if you could just talk about a little bit about your thoughts of like the similarity of rock and concrete.
Yeah, I obviously there's the fabrication side of the argument, which talks about subtractive versus casting and the issues of resource, which is like, one is stone has no value when it's in a quarry. It only has a value when you carve it into something, when you polish it, when you ship it a great distance. Whereas concrete only has a value if it's cast into something that's intelligent. So the formwork is where the value is acquired. But that's really only just like kind of information to help make decisions about where to place energy in a project. I think my position on this is that I've stopped making a distinction between the difference of concrete and stone. I will make a distinction between reinforced concrete, which is a totally different animal than what we're working with, which is like just solid objects that know their relationship to gravity in the ground. However, I think perception is a much more interesting problem to address, because the first few megaliths that we made were actually foam, and they were coated in glass fiber concrete. And it is different. It is actually different than a legitimately heavy thing, even though it's still fairly heavy. It moves differently. However, the perception of that thing from a distance, you see it as one thing, you understand it as one thing, it performs differently. And for us, it was a kind of stepping stone to get up to the actual heavy ones that we ultimately did get to. But for me, I think there's that game of the trickery and the perception that you can see throughout our work. So there was an early project called Helix, which is a concrete spiral stair that presents it like it is a spiral stair. You can't see anything other than a spiral stair until you get closer to it and you start realizing that it's adjacent to an actual stair in the space. It is half scale, so you can't walk up it. And if you press it, it swings because it's hung from the ceiling, even though it looks like it's laden on the ground. So for me, this is obviously like playing this game of like looking at something that you think you understand, you think you know as one thing. And then when you engage with it and the performance of that there are so many different avenues to start to expand the experience of the subject object relationship. So that's the other side, which is like, for me, what is the difference, between a stone and concrete at that point? If you're using it as a tool to explore perceptual difference and cognitive dissonance, they both work.
Well, we are at time. Brandon, I want to thank you again. It's really great to see you and to see the work. And my big takeaway in this moment, and that will probably change as I reflect back on the talk and the questions, which I think are really great questions to help like tease out more from you. But I'm most blown away by the generosity of your work. Like it is like such a, Adam mentioned earlier that there's maybe a kind of potential for kind of esoteric niche work that you're doing, but the way that you pursue it, the way it permeates your teaching and your thoughts about how we learn, detached from your own teaching, but just like how architecture and making and thinking about the construction of the world is fundamentally a kind of pedagogical act. And again, like your generosity in the way that you're doing the work and the way that you're putting it out in the world, I deeply appreciate that. So thank you again. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you all for coming. This Friday, we're going to have some alumni of the Bachelor of Architecture program back to talk about what they're doing now and how their time at CCA influenced them. So I hope you'll all join us for that on Friday. Bye, everyone.
Good to see everyone. Thank you.